They called me the Fat Painter. Not behind my back, to my face. At my own exhibitions, in front of my own work. I remember the first time I heard it. I was 23 years old, standing next to a canvas I had spent for months painting. A woman in a white blazer walked past it, leaned toward her friend, and whispered loud enough for the entire room to hear, "Who let the chubby kid hang his finger paintings in here?" The room laughed. I didn't leave. I stood there with a plastic cup of cheap wine in my hand and smiled like it didn't split something open inside me. That was the first lesson nobody teaches you about humiliation. You learn to wear it like a coat. You get so used to the weight of it that you forget what it felt like to stand straight. My name is Everett Calloway. I grew up in Roanoke, Virginia. I was not special by any measure the world uses to decide these things. I was not from money. I was not connected. I was not thin, which in the art world, a world obsessed with how things look, turned out to matter more than I expected. I was just a heavy kid from a small city who loved painting more than he loved anything else, which is either a gift or a curse depending on the day you ask. I had been painting since I was 5 years old. By the time I stood in that room listening to people laugh, I had given 15 years of my life to this. 15 years of early mornings and late nights and sketchbooks filled and canvases stretched and paint under my fingernails that never fully washed out. 15 years of believing that if you worked hard enough and cared deeply enough, the work would eventually speak for itself. That night taught me the work doesn't always get to speak. Sometimes the room is too busy laughing. I went home after that exhibition and sat on the floor of my apartment and stared at the wall for a long time. I didn't cry. I was too tired to cry. I just sat there and thought about whether any of this was worth what it was costing me. Not money. Something harder to replace than money. I decided to keep going. Not because I was brave. Because I didn't know how to stop. Painting was the only language I had ever been fully fluent in, and walking away from it would have meant becoming someone I didn't recognize. So I kept going. And this is the story of where that decision led me, through years of rejection and silence and rooms full of people who looked right through me, all the way to the most unlikely ending I could have written for myself. Stick with me while I share my story, and if it touches you, don't forget to support our channel by hitting that subscribe button, dropping a like, and sharing it with the people you care about. I grew up in a house that smelled like turpentine and cigarette smoke. My mother, Nadine Calloway, painted watercolors on Sunday afternoons. She wasn't famous. She wasn't the kind of talented that gets written about anywhere, but she painted with a quiet joy that made our small house in Roanoke feel like something sacred was happening in the corner of the living room. Like even the ordinary afternoon light meant something when she was working in it. She put a brush in my hand when I was 5 years old. That was it. That was all it took. From that first afternoon I never wanted to do anything else. By 7 I was painting every day after school. By 10 I had filled 3 sketchbooks and covered my bedroom walls with drawings my mother framed with masking tape and called masterpieces. She never once told me I wasn't good enough. She never looked at my work with anything other than that soft full smile that made me feel like what I had made actually mattered in the world. She died when I was 14. Pancreatic cancer. 11 weeks from the day they told us to the day she was gone. I didn't understand then how something could move that fast and still be permanent. The night she passed I was sitting in a hospital hallway holding a drawing I had made for her, sunflowers, because she loved them, and I remember thinking I would never show that drawing to anyone else. It belonged to her. It had always belonged to her. After she was gone I kept painting, not because anyone encouraged me. My father Clyde was a quiet hard man who worked long shifts at a sheet metal factory and came home too exhausted for feelings. He wasn't mean about it. He just wasn't there for it. And I learned early that indifference can sit in a house just as heavily as cruelty. It just makes less noise. I was the heavy kid in the art room through all 4 years of high school. I ate lunch alone. I spent free periods filling sketchbooks. My classmates weren't cruel exactly. They were just teenagers, which sometimes comes to the same thing. I existed in their world as background. Furniture. The fat boy who drew pictures. I applied to 3 art schools at 17 and got into one. The Whitmore Institute of Fine Arts in Philadelphia. My father drove me there in his truck, helped carry 2 boxes up 3 flights of stairs, shook my hand at the door and drove home. 4 hours of driving. 1 handshake. That was his send-off. I stood alone in that dormitory hallway and told myself everything was about to change. I was right about that. I was just completely wrong about what the change would look like or what it would cost me to survive it. Whitmore was not what I expected. I don't know exactly what I had expected. Something warmer, maybe. Something that felt like belonging. What I found instead was a place where talent was worn like expensive jewelry and everyone seemed to have arrived already knowing who they were going to become. They came from money, most of them. From families that took summer trips to Florence and owned original prints and talked about art the way other families talked about football. They had the easy confidence of people who had never once doubted that their voice deserved to be heard. I came from Roanoke with a duffel bag and a second-hand easel. My work was different from theirs and I knew it immediately. They painted clean and cool and intellectual, minimalist pieces that said very little in very controlled ways. I painted with everything I had. Big canvases, deep color, faces that looked like they were trying to say something they couldn't find words for. To me that was the whole point. To them it was a problem. My professor, Aldrich Fenn, made that clear early. He was the kind of man who spoke about art like he was delivering verdicts. Same corduroy jacket every day. Zero warmth. During my first major class critique he stood in front of my work, tilted his head, and said, with what I can only describe as genuine confusion, "What exactly are you trying to communicate here, Mr. Calloway? Because what I'm receiving is noise." The class didn't laugh. They smiled with their eyes instead, which was worse than laughing. I was 20 years old. I went back to that painting and revised it 6 times trying to make it into something he would respect. Each revision took something real out of it. By the 6th version it was quieter and cleaner and completely hollow. He gave it a B- and moved on. I threw the original version in a dumpster behind the building and told myself it was fine. It was not fine. The social part of Whitmore was its own quiet injury. I was heavier than most students there and in a world built entirely around how things look, my body became attached to my work whether I wanted it to or not. Comments about my paintings and comments about me had a way of blending together. Too heavy. Too much. Too emotional. People believed they were discussing brushwork. They were not only discussing brushwork. I made one real friend. Tobias Greer, Toby, a thin quiet kid from Ohio who painted hyperrealistic portraits and ate the same peanut butter sandwich every single day without apology. Toby had no interest in posturing. He cared about the work. We spent weekends in the studio together in comfortable silence and he was the only person at Whitmore who ever told me the honest truth about my painting, when it was working and when it wasn't. He kept me from quitting more than once without either of us ever saying so directly. I graduated in the bottom third of my class. Professor Fenn's final written evaluation said I showed passion but lacked discipline and would benefit from restraint. I kept that evaluation, folded it and put it in a drawer and left it there. I had a reason for keeping it that I didn't fully understand yet. After graduation I moved to Pittsburgh. No particular reason. It was cheaper than Philadelphia and I knew nobody there. And at that point in my life not knowing anyone somewhere felt less like loneliness and more like a clean slate. I found a studio apartment on Fenwick Street with one large window facing north. Good light, my mother would have said. I set up my easel in the corner, stacked my supplies against the wall, and made myself a quiet promise. 5 years. I would give this 5 years before I admitted it wasn't going to work. I started applying to galleries immediately. What followed was 2 years and 61 rejections. I kept a notebook. The date, the gallery name, what they said. Most said nothing. You submitted your portfolio online and the silence that came back was its own complete answer. The ones that did respond were sometimes worse than silence. Not a fit for our current program. We appreciate your submission but are not accepting new artists. Your work is technically competent but lacks a coherent artistic identity. That last one came from Harriet Vossi, who ran a gallery on Penn Avenue and had a reputation for finding new talent. She had agreed to look at my portfolio in person, which almost never happened. I took the bus across the city with 12 photographs of my best work in a folder I had pressed flat the night before. She flipped through them without expression, looked up over her reading glasses, said the line about artistic identity, and then asked whether I had ever considered graphic design as an alternative career path. I rode the bus home and did not paint for 11 days. Those 11 days were the hardest stretch I can remember. I was still working part-time at a print shop on Harmon Avenue so my hands stayed busy, but the absence of painting felt like something physical, like holding my breath for 11 days straight. On the 12th morning I went back to the studio and stretched the largest canvas I had ever worked on, 6 feet by 8 feet, and I painted for 17 hours without stopping. I didn't eat. I didn't sleep. I just painted until whatever had closed up inside me opened again. I started showing at local markets and community art fairs to make up for the gallery rejections. The cruelty there was more direct, less polished. A man at my third market showing picked up one of my smaller pieces, turned it sideways, turned it upside down, set it back down and walked away laughing. A group of teenagers stood in front of my booth for 10 solid minutes making jokes I could hear every word of. A woman at a church art fair looked at my price tags and told me my pricing was very optimistic in a tone that made it sound like a medical opinion. I sold roughly one piece a month, sometimes less. The print shop paid rent and groceries. The painting money paid for more paint. That was the entire economy of my life. Toby called every few weeks from Ohio where he had moved back to take care of his mother. He had stopped painting professionally and was teaching art at a middle school. He said he didn't hate it. I could tell he didn't love it either. Every call ended the same way. I would tell him the truth about how things were going and he would say, "Keep going, Evie. The work is real. Keep going." I kept going. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have known, was that someone had already been watching me do it. He appeared at my 7th public exhibition. I remember it specifically because the 7th was the first one I almost didn't go to. It was a community arts showcase in a rented hall on Delwood Avenue. Folding tables, bad lighting, 30 local artists trying not to look as desperate as they felt. I had stayed up until 2 in the morning the night before talking myself out of attending. I went only because I had already paid the $20 booth fee and couldn't afford to let it go to waste. He was standing at the back of the room when I arrived. An old man, maybe 75, maybe older, in a dark wool coat that was clearly expensive but didn't advertise itself. He was alone. No companion, no catalogue, no drink in his hand. Just standing there with the patient stillness of someone who had spent a lifetime knowing how to wait. He moved around the room slowly. He didn't stop long at anything, until he reached my booth. He stood in front of my largest piece, a painting I called Interior, a lone figure sitting in a dark room with one window casting light across their hands, and he looked at it the way almost nobody looks at art. Not the polite 30-second glance people give when they want to appear thoughtful. A real look. The kind that makes you feel like the painting is being read word by word rather than just seen. He said nothing. He bought nothing. After about 10 minutes he moved on and left the building. I told myself it meant nothing. He came to the next exhibition. And the one after that. Over the next 3 years he showed up at 14 of my showings. Always alone. Always that same dark coat. Always standing in front of my work longer than anyone else in the room. Always leaving without a word, without a purchase, without anything more than a brief moment of eye contact that he never held long enough for me to read. I started looking for him. I am a little embarrassed admitting that now, that his presence had quietly become something I depended on. When I arrived at an exhibition I would scan the back of the room first. On the nights he wasn't there something felt off, like a familiar sound had stopped without explanation. I never walked over to him. I cannot fully explain why. There was something about his stillness, the way he seemed to exist at a slight distance from everything around him, that made me feel approaching him would break something fragile that I didn't yet understand. Toby came to visit once and saw him from across the room. At dinner afterward he put his fork down and looked at me. "You've never talked to him," he said. I told him no. He told me to go talk to him next time. There were 4 more next times after that. I never talked to him. Then one day he simply stopped coming. The breaking point came on a Tuesday in November. I had spent 3 weeks preparing for one final gallery submission. A new space had opened on Callister Street, modern, well-funded, the kind of place that got reviewed in Pittsburgh arts publications. I told myself if this one said no then I was done. Not done painting. Done trying to make the world care about it. I rewrote my artist statement 11 times. I photographed every piece in the best light my apartment windows could offer. I sent the statement to Toby and he called me back and said it was the best thing I had ever written. I held on to that. The gallery director was a young man named Preston Whitfield, maybe 28 years old. The kind of person who wears confidence so naturally you can't tell where the person ends and the performance begins. He had agreed to a brief in-person review which felt like a victory before it even happened. I brought 5 physical prints and my full portfolio on a tablet. I sat across from him at a glass desk and watched him swipe through my work with the same rhythm someone uses scrolling through their phone at the end of a long day. Fast. Distracted. Already somewhere else. He stopped on one image. Interior. The same painting the old man had stood in front of for 10 minutes. He looked at it for 4 seconds. I counted. "It's competent," he said. "But it's not what we're looking for. Our program is focused on artists with a defined market presence. Your work doesn't have a clear audience." I asked him what that meant. He smiled the way people smile when they consider the question beneath them. "It means the work is fine," he said. "It's just not notable. You understand?" I understood. I took the bus home, walked up 3 flights of stairs, stood in the middle of my studio and looked at the canvases covering every wall, years of them, hundreds of hours of them, and felt something give way inside me that I had been quietly holding together for a very long time. I picked up one of the smaller canvases, a piece I loved. I carried it out to the fire escape. It was cold. The city was doing what cities do at night, glowing and humming and paying absolutely no attention to anything happening on one small fire escape above Phoenix Street. I held the canvas over the railing and stood there thinking about just letting it fall. I stood there for a long time. I brought it back inside. I sat down on the studio floor and cried in a way I had not cried since I was 14 years old in a hospital hallway holding a drawing of sunflowers. When it passed I felt hollow and surprisingly still. Like a room after a bad storm has finally moved through it. I picked up a brush. I didn't plan what came next. I didn't think about audience or market presence or what Preston Whitfield would say if he saw it. I just painted the truest thing I had inside me at that moment. A father and a son. The father's face turned away. The son's hands reaching toward light coming through a window the father couldn't see. I didn't know why that image came out of me. It arrived the way the sunflower drawing had arrived at 14, not as a decision but as something that simply had to exist. I finished at 6 in the morning. I stood back and looked at it in the early grey light and felt something I had never felt before about anything I had made. A complete and quiet certainty. I called it the distance between us. I almost never showed it to anyone. 6 months later I submitted the distance between us to a small group exhibition at a non-profit art center on Mercer Street. It wasn't a prestigious venue. It wasn't the kind of opportunity that changes careers. It was just a decent space with good walls and people who actually cared about what was hanging on them. After everything that had happened with galleries and directors and 4-second looks, that felt like enough. The exhibition ran for 3 weeks. In the second week I received a letter. Not an email. A physical letter, handwritten, delivered to the art center and forwarded to my apartment. The envelope was thick cream-colored paper with no return address. My name on the front was written in the slow, careful handwriting of someone very old, each letter deliberate, like it had been thought about before it was made. Inside was a single page. Mr. Calloway, I have followed your work for several years. I have not introduced myself because some distances are easier to maintain than to explain. The painting currently on display at the Mercer Street Art Center is the finest thing I have seen in 40 years of looking at art. I would like to purchase it and several others at whatever price you believe they are worth. If you are willing, please contact my attorney whose information is enclosed. SR. There was a business card inside. The attorney's name was Franklin Deere. Washington, D.C. address. I read the letter 4 times standing in my kitchen. Then I called Toby. He was quiet for a moment after I read it to him. SR, he said slowly. And a D.C. attorney. That's all I know, I told him. Everett, he said. Be careful. I called Franklin Deere the next morning. He was precise and professional and gave away almost nothing. His client was serious. The offer was genuine. Confidentiality was essential. He asked me to name my price for the distance between us and 4 additional works of my choosing. I named a number that felt almost embarrassing to say out loud, higher than anything I had ever asked for. The kind of number you say and then immediately want to take back. Franklin Deere told me he would relay it and call me back. He called back in 2 hours. Your price has been accepted, he said. All 5 pieces. The total came to $240,000. I sat in my studio on Phoenix Street for a long time after I put the phone down. I looked at the walls around me, all the canvases that had never sold, all the years of work the world had called undisciplined and excessive and not notable and fine but not notable. I thought about the woman in the white blazer at my very first exhibition. I thought about Preston Whitfield and his 4-second look at interior. I thought about an old man in a dark wool coat who had stood in front of my work longer than anyone and never once said a single word. 3 months after the sale, Franklin Deere called me again. His client wanted to meet in person. He was brief about it the way lawyers are brief when the full truth behind something is more complicated than the words being used to describe it. He said his client was elderly and his health was declining and that if I was willing to meet, the meeting should happen soon. Something in the way he said soon made me agree before I had finished thinking about it. The meeting was arranged at a private residence outside Washington. A large quiet house set back from the road behind a gravel driveway with the kind of deep stillness that only exists when money has made sure nothing intrudes on it. Franklin Deere met me at the front door and walked me down a hallway lined with paintings, real paintings, the kind I had only ever seen in textbooks, and into a sitting room where an old man was waiting in a chair by the window. I stopped in the doorway. It was him. The dark wool coat was gone. He was in a cardigan now, smaller than I remembered, diminished by illness in the particular way that happens when a body has begun its final argument with time. But the stillness was the same. The patient careful eyes were exactly the same. He looked at me for a long moment and said, "Sit down, Everett." "Not Mr. Calloway. My first name," said quietly and with a weight I felt before I understood it. I sat down. What followed was 2 hours I have never been able to fully explain to anyone. He told me his name, Salvatore Renner, born Salvatore Rinaldi in a small Virginia town to an Italian immigrant father and an American mother. He spoke about his life carefully and selectively, the way a man speaks when he has spent decades knowing exactly which words can be turned against him. He had been, he said without softening it or apologizing for it, a powerful man in a world that existed outside the law. He had built something large and ruthless and had held it together for 40 years. And then he told me about my mother. Nadine Calloway was 24 years old when they met. He was 38 and already dangerous and already living inside a world where caring about someone was something that could be used against you. They had known each other less than a year. When she told him she was pregnant, he made a decision he described as the worst of his life, in a voice so flat it passed its own judgment without needing mine. He walked away. He told himself it was protection. That a man like him had no business pulling a child into his world. That staying away was its own form of love. He had been telling himself that for 50 years. "I knew where you were," he said. "I always knew. I knew when your mother died. I knew when you went to Philadelphia. I knew when you moved to Pittsburgh." The room was very quiet. "You came to my exhibitions," I said. "Yes." "For 3 years." "Yes." I looked at him, this old man, this stranger, this person who was somehow the reason I existed, and felt something move through me that was too large and too shapeless to name. Not quite grief, not quite anger. Something that held both of those things and still had room for more. "Why didn't you say anything?" I asked. He was quiet for a long time. "Because I didn't deserve to," he said. Salvatore Renner died 4 months after that meeting. I was not in the obituary. I did not attend the service. Franklin Deere called me 3 days after the death and asked me to come to Washington, and I took the first bus I could get a seat on. The will was read in a conference room in Franklin Deere's office. I sat at a long table with people I had never seen before and was not introduced to. Lawyers, associates, people whose relationship to Salvatore existed in a world I had no access to and no desire to enter. The atmosphere in the room was the specific kind of tense that settles in when powerful people don't know what is coming next. The will was long. Page after page of it meant nothing to me. And then Franklin Deere read a single section that changed everything. Salvatore Renner had set aside $10 million. Not for a person. Not for an organization. For the acquisition of one painting. The Distance Between Us by Everett Calloway. To be purchased at that sum and donated to the National Portrait Gallery in Washington, D.C. beneath a plaque that would read, "In memory of Nadine Calloway, who taught a child that making something beautiful is never a waste." The room shifted when those words landed. I felt it before I understood it. I sat completely still. The people around that table looked at me with expressions I couldn't fully read. Not hostility exactly. Something more complicated. The look of people who had believed they understood a man and were now quietly revising that understanding. I thought about my mother. Sunday afternoons. Watercolors. Hymns in a small kitchen. I thought about a man who had stood in the back of terrible little exhibition halls for 3 years in a Goodwill coat watching his son get dismissed and mocked and overlooked, and had never once opened his mouth. I thought about the painting. The father with his face turned away. The son's hands reaching toward the light. I had painted something true without knowing it was true. The reaction from the art world was exactly as loud and hollow as you would expect. When the story became public, the coverage was enormous. People who had ignored my work for years suddenly had opinions about it. Harriet Vossi told an arts publication she had always seen something remarkable in what I did. I read that once and did not read it again. Preston Whitfield contacted me through his gallery's website requesting a meeting about representation. I left that unanswered. Professor Fenn, retired by then, was quoted somewhere saying he remembered me as a student with raw emotional power that needed more time to develop. I printed that quote and placed it next to the evaluation he had written 20 years earlier. I still have both. The painting was installed on a Thursday morning in April. I arrived before the gallery opened, before the cameras, before the crowds, before the story belonged to anyone but me. I stood in front of it alone in the quiet and spoke to him, not out loud exactly, just enough. I said, "I understand why. I don't know if I forgive you yet, but I understand why." People ask me what the $10 million meant to me. I tell them the truth. The money changed my external life completely and my internal life almost not at all. I have a real studio now. A large light-filled space in a building I own in Pittsburgh, 3 blocks from the print shop where I used to cut and fold other people's work for hourly pay. I have gallery representation in 4 cities. I have sold paintings to collectors whose names I once only saw in magazines. The mockery has stopped, or at least it has moved somewhere far enough away that I can no longer hear it. But none of that is what I think about when I am alone in the studio in the early morning hours before the world starts making its demands. I think about my mother humming hymns on a Sunday afternoon in a small house in Roanoke. I think about a 14-year-old boy sitting on a hospital hallway floor holding a drawing of sunflowers that he made for someone who would never see it. I think about all the nights in Pittsburgh when I almost stopped, when the rejection had piled so high it felt less like failure and more like a wall with no way around it. And I think about a man I met only once at the very end of his life. A man who stood quietly in the back of every room where his son was being laughed at. Who could have walked forward at any moment across any of those 14 exhibitions and said one word, just one word, and changed everything. Who chose instead to love from a distance so complete it looked exactly like absence. I used to think that was cowardice. I am no longer sure what it was. What I know is this. He saw me when no one else was looking. He watched me refuse to quit through years of silence and rejection and rooms full of people who found me forgettable. And at the end of his life, with everything he had built and everything he had done and everything he could never undo, the one thing he chose to spend $10 million on was making sure my mother's name was on a wall in a place that lasts. Not my name. Hers. That tells me something about what he carried. What he never stopped carrying. I think about what we inherit from people we barely knew. Not money. Not names. Something quieter than both. A way of holding on when holding on makes no visible sense. A refusal to let go of the thing you were made to do even when the world has made its indifference perfectly clear. My mother gave me that. Somewhere underneath everything he became I think my father had it too. The painting hangs in the National Portrait Gallery now. If you ever find yourself in Washington and you find yourself standing in front of it, the figure with the face turned away, the hands reaching toward the light coming through a window, stay with it for a while. Not 30 seconds. A real while. Because that painting was never really about art. It is about everyone who has ever made something honest in a room where nobody was paying attention. It is about every child who needed someone to stay and got silence instead. It is about love that comes too late and still comes. And it is about a quiet old man in a dark coat who never missed a single showing, never bought a single piece, never said a single word, and was there anyway. Every time. In every season. Year after year. Watching his son refuse to disappear. Watching his son refuse to disappear. That is what the $10 million was for. Not the painting. Not the career. Not the validation of everyone who looked away. The refusal. Just the refusal. If this story stayed with you, if it moved something in you, please subscribe, leave a like, and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Because somewhere right now someone is standing next to something they made in a room full of people who are laughing. And they need to know that the story does not end there. It never ends there.